Good evening and welcome to the second session of our Foundation Year program. Just as last week, we were privileged to have been led through the Epic of Gilgamesh by Dr. Carmen Palmer of the University of Toronto. So we have her with us again, this time to assist us as we approach something closer to her actual area of specialism, the books of Genesis and Exodus in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Before we get started, though, I want to remind viewers that the Foundation Year program is brought to you by the Center for Applied Theology and more locally by your Urban Abbey. The Center for Applied Theology was established to make opportunities for good theological study more widely available, while Urban Abbeys foster local engagement with the source material. Together, they seek to bring Christians together and to encourage them in their faith while providing food for the intellect. If this idea interests you, I would encourage you to visit the CAT website and to take out a membership that will enable you to participate actively in this venture. But now I will hand you over to the expertise of Dr. Carmen Palmer, who will be questioned on Exodus and Genesis by Father David Harris of St. Giles in Reading, together with Lucy Stothard and Daniel Masters. Welcome again to Dr. Carmen Palmer, who's joining us tonight to continue our discussion of ancient texts. Last week she was with us discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh. Tonight we move into the world of the Hebrew people and the books of Genesis and Exodus. David, I'll ask you to start with the questions.
Excellent. Once again, we said informally beforehand how grateful we were for last week. And indeed we were. And the themes, many of us have been talking about them ever since. So we're very grateful for that. Now, in particular, jumping right in, all of these themes that are present in the literature of the ancient world, somehow it's a very different thing to find a text like Gilgamesh, 3,000 years later and uncover it. The texts of the Hebrew Bible, have been with us for thousands of years, but they've never left our memory. Like they've been part of that makes them, I think, very different. What are the themes that you'd want to draw? Many of our listeners and participants in this would be familiar with the Hebrew Bible, but what are the themes that you'd want to draw their attention to?
That's a great question. And I think I really enjoy how you also started that with the idea of texts that have been with us for a long time, and that we can see a trend of ongoing transmission and stability, as well as some other ancient interpreters reimagining or sort of re-prophetizing how texts and their narratives worked as well. So it's great to be here again. And I would say if we're looking at major themes, in particular to carry over from last week, a key theme would simply be to have an understanding of the relationship between God and God's people. And in so doing, also to have kind of an understanding of what's the nature of God. And in addition to that, what is human nature? If we're trying to look at how, what is their rapport together, but also what is their unique features in terms of divine and the human realms. And so today, last week, I know we first started to talk about ideologies and narratives that are used to describe, how things came to be the way that they are. And today I want to continue that a bit. I think some important themes would be to look at the creation accounts, Genesis 1 to 3, and also to look at the ancestral cycles, or as what some would call the patriarch cycles. And again, here we also see, what is the forging of this rapport, this building relationship and covenant between God and God's people, and sort of how the narrative carries on from there.
Well, Lucy's going to jump right into the ancestral cycles, which I think will be fascinating. The creation narratives. We have all kinds of stories about creation from different cultures. What would you say are the unique, maybe first for us, differentiate between the two creation stories that are contained in Genesis, and what are the themes that come out of them that are particularly unique?
So yes, we have Genesis 1 to 3. And in fact, these are actually two separate accounts that have been subsequently combined together. If we look at Genesis 1, we see this, really kind of beautiful narrative of these 6 days of creation and sort of God forming creation from a void, right? And also sort of the ways that the earth is gradually brought together, and that then on the 7th day, God sees everything is good. There's a great ongoing theme in this chapter where we see that, God saw that it was good. Ki tov, which is like, it was good. And there's this repetition. It was good, it was good, it was good. So creation is good. I mean, that's really central as a theme in terms of the first creation account. And another really important theme, of course, then, is that on the 7th day, it was complete and God rested. So this narrative can also function as an ideology, as an explanation for the need to have Sabbath, the Sabbath ritual, that for this one day of the week, you take a rest. And so these are some two sort of critical things that we see there, that creation is good, and also that it helps us to understand for what reason do we entertain Sabbath and have a rest once a week as well. And then we move into this really interesting creation narrative in Genesis 2 and 3, which is a really different flavor, right? We see God being described in very anthropomorphic terms, right? Sort of God being described in human-like terms, and we learn about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and how they have relationship together, how they have come into being. But we also see that, what is human nature? Humans are inclined to err, or at least certainly to have free will. It's not even seen necessarily as error. Eve purposely decides to, share this fruit with Adam, right? They make decisions. It looks good to eat, and therefore they go ahead. But of course, it's really interesting in this narrative. We see how God is actually quite agitated almost. They hear the sound of God walking about in the garden, but the verb that's used is a verb that, or the style, the way the verb is conjugated, it indicates sort of harried, busy activity. So it's not this like calm God, floating about, but rather this image of God sort of, rushing to and fro, pacing back and forth, sort of like, where are you? So it's a really interesting narrative too, in that it has a different flavor. But also we get to see this kind of poignant relationship as it forms between God and Adam and Eve, and learning that humans have knowledge of good and bad, but in order to prevent them from being any more godlike at this point, they don't want humans to become immortal, right? Which is one of the things we learned about last week in Gilgamesh too. Humans are mortal, right? Adam and Eve do not eat from the tree of life. They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. So we have another account that sort of explains human nature, the rapport between humans and God, and again offers some explanation as to, we see a very agricultural world, that they're going to till the soil, that it will be hard, it will be challenging, and we learn a little bit more about human nature from this creation account as well.
Getting back to your first point about the importance of creation being called good, was it it's so difficult because sort of philosophically as Christians, we can't help reading this stuff without hearing Augustine in our head, right?
Yeah.
So in when those ancient texts emerged, was there a kind of deliberate anti-dualism going on? Like, was it a sense of affirmation of the good of creation, that this isn't a mixture of good and evil, this is good, and then evil kind of enters from the side? But was that part of the image that they were working on?
Oh, David, that's a really good question. I think it involves two parts. On the one hand, so for this first account, the Genesis 1, we would say that this is a priestly account. And I think I would be a little hesitant to say that it's a dualism at this point. Like, I don't know per se that I would argue that the idea is to try to contrast, that humanity is good against something that is evil. Much later, for example, in apocalyptic literature, in the Hellenistic period, we do see a real kind of good against evil theme arising. But I don't really think that's the case here. Rather, it's just affirming the goodness of creation and the goodness of God. But I think you're right that Christians have really questioned for a long time if everything is made in God's image, including humanity, and everything comes from God, then from where does evil come? And I think that really is a question that has stayed with us, right, throughout time, and does continue to evoke, a lot of reflection. But even there, we do see, I think the narrative itself is also still working this question out, right? We do see little bits where we do understand that there's a serpent, right? So there are other agents who are functioning on their own as well. But rather that humans, because they've been given free will, it's sort of through this that somehow they're also of their own free will able to choose to do good or to choose to do bad.
Okay, I'd like to talk for about 3 more hours.
About that, I know.
I think I should hand it off to Lucy to go into the ancestral cycles in Genesis.
Wonderful, thank you, Father. So I think some of the accounts with which we are most encouraged to identify in our own relationships and walks with God are the accounts of his dealings with the patriarchs, I think particularly Abraham. So the first question we have would be, what are the central ways that the ancestors or something known as the patriarchs assist our understanding of the relationship between God and God's people?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, and Abraham, of course, is so crucial here in terms of being the first patriarch who establishes this relationship with God. I think if we first look to Genesis 12, and then from there to chapters 15 and 17, we first see this relationship building, and we learn that it is a covenant. And so in the ancient Near East, covenants, I think oftentimes today we talk about covenant in sort of very nice terms, and, it's a very lovely thing. But covenants were really serious. And, that it entailed the sacrifice of an animal, and that, two different parties would make solemn vows around what each party was going to do. And I think that right from the beginning is so critical to understanding that relationship between God and then God's people, insofar that both parties are a part of the covenant and they both have responsibilities that they have to uphold. And so God promises to uphold the promise of land, and also the promise of subsequent generations. God has promises as well to uphold. And then from Abraham's side, we see the strong need for obedience, which, again, in our contemporary terms is sometimes hard to grasp. But this idea of covenantal obedience was really foundational. And then in addition to that, the sign of this covenant, which was circumcision.
And actually, that was a question I intended to ask, because I've never actually managed to find a satisfactory answer for this in all of my years studying the Bible, why did the covenant include this act? And what is it symbolic of? Because I know St. Paul picks up on it later, but I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I mean, and circumcision becomes a thematic issue, you're right, throughout Judaism and subsequently throughout early Christianity as well. And even within the Hebrew Bible itself, we see the beginning, right? We understand this idea of circumcision as a sign, a visible sign initially. And circumcision was something that was practiced on a number of different nations. I mean, it's not like it was emerged ex nihilo there. It was a symbol that was, or a custom that was practiced elsewhere as well. And then we do see circumcision over time represent this promise. But also we even see the Hebrew Bible already start to talk about circumcision of the heart. So we see this recognition that it's not simply the physical actions that you do, but the moral compass that you contain inside. In other words, the rationale for why you're doing certain activities. And this debate is ongoing throughout the Hebrew Bible as well. For example, even in some prophetic texts where we read about what seem to be calls for the end of temple cult or temple sacrifice, which really could simply be a call for temple cult reform, right? Already an idea that, you know, certain actions are being performed thinking solely about the correct way of the action, as opposed to, you know, we really need to think about the rationale behind why we're doing this as well, like in terms of our choice of behaviors. And this idea of circumcision of the heart, as you say, right, carries on straight through until the writings of Paul, in terms of, you know, we see other early Jewish writers speaking in similar terms. Philo, for example, also writes about circumcision of the heart and bodily circumcision. And, you know, each author considers circumcision differently, and circumcision of the heart. For each one, they kind of interpret it in different ways. But again, similar notion to, you know, a physical symbol versus also what is represented in our heart behind the actions that we pursue in our relationship with God.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about the covenant and the requirements placed on Abraham, and also to a lesser degree, I think, to Noah as well. Just rewinding a little bit.
Oh yes, from last week, yeah.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to me because we can read the fall, the account of the fall. We can really read that as having been a matter of pride and self-will, which gives birth to disobedience. And so later on, of course, St. Paul expounds on this and talks about how it was the obedience of Christ that undid the disobedience of Adam. And I could go very Catholic here and start talking about Our Lady, but I'm not going to. Would you agree that this covenant with Abraham is really where we see the start of the redemptive process, if you like?
I think I would answer it a little between the two options and say that it's an ongoing continuation. Yeah. I think within Christian theology, we have subsequently interpreted, you know, the Adam and Eve narrative as a fall. But I think within the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, in this case, it's not seen so much as a fall. Rather, it's seen as the description of this is why things are the way they are. Okay. But I absolutely agree that the subsequent ongoing activity that we see happening between the patriarchs and God do carry on an idea of God's ongoing sense of forgiveness, reconciliation, and an ongoing relationship, right? This is something we see a lot in, most strongly, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, that the people will be disobedient, but that subsequently when they turn their heart back to God, then there is forgiveness and a renewal of the covenant again. And but you're right. I mean, we also see this ongoing sense that humans do need ongoing forgiveness, even the patriarchs, right? And that they do have to, they are put to the test. For example, Abraham in Genesis 22, be told to sacrifice his own son. This is a really hard narrative to read, but it's such an intriguing narrative too, right? Because we see, Abraham and Isaac getting ready to go to the high place, and Isaac's like, okay, well, here's the firewood, and where's the animal that we're going to sacrifice? And there's silence, and the narrative just says they walked on. There's silence, heavily hanging. In between the written word, we can read this non-word, right? This real tension, and that subsequently, right? It's really just at the moment when Abraham's finally about to, raise his knife and commit the act, that God's like, oh, it's okay. Actually, I can see that you're being obedient. Here's a ram off in the thicket or whatever. But it's really tense because, it seems like God is about to undo God's own end of the promise, right? If Isaac dies, how are there going to be on in subsequent generations? How is that promise even going to be continued? So it's sort of a push-pull between both sides, again, needing to uphold their end of the promise. But also right from this get-go, what's Abraham going to do? What decision is he going to make? Yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I really can't leave this without asking you about Jacob. Because when we come to the narrative of Jacob and Esau, I think there's a temptation to see Esau as being a little bit hard done to, especially when I think later on in the Bible it says, Esau I have hated, but Jacob I have loved. And I did once read a commentary, and it said, it's not surprising that God hated Esau, although he didn't hate him. It's biblical hyperbole. What's surprising is that he loved Jacob. Would you agree? And what does that reveal about the nature of God as he appears in these narratives?
You ask all these really great theological questions, Lucy. I think for this, it highlights, again, it's a really interesting narrative, right? We see there's all these kind of reversals that end up happening. And this is another account of a kind of a reversal, right? Where Esau loses out on his birthright, and instead, Jacob gets it instead. And Jacob does become favored, right? And he does become the one to have the subsequent generations, and they become the tribes. Like he's, foundational and critical. But we do see places in the narrative too, where, and we do understand there's little hints in the narrative around, what could it be that Esau has done that's caused all these problems? Well, he's gone off and he's married foreign spouses, and this, that, and the other. And these are sort of things in the narrative that these are things that you should not be doing if you're trying to uphold a certain promise. But in a way, we also see, right, at the end of the day, Jacob and Esau become, they reconcile as well. And we see that they're both given, they both receive blessings in different kinds of ways. But yeah, Jacob, another very complex character and critical to moving on the narrative to help us understand, right, where all these tribes came from, and to carry on the narrative in that fashion.
Wonderful, thank you. I could sit and talk about this with you all evening, but I'm under strict instructions to hand you over to Dan now, so that's what I'm going to do.
Hello.
Hi, Dan,
so I'm
how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. And yourself? Well, you've already told us, but anyway. So
I am good, thank you.
Great. So I'm going to be asking questions about Exodus. And I want to start by going through the three sort of big relationships with God in the text. And the first one is that relationship between God and Moses. And one of the things about that is that Moses becomes his mouthpiece. And that made me think in terms of Moses as being kind of like a sort of priest-like figure. It's almost that he's given the message and he goes and speaks it to the people. I was wondering if you expand on that, or whether you had a different sense of what Moses' relationship with God, perhaps.
I think you've really started to unpack it quite well. In fact, throughout tradition, Moses has been seen as priest and prophet, right? Because not only is he God, in so being God's mouthpiece, in a way he's become an intermediary figure. And this function of intermediary is also exactly what the prophets are, right? So Moses himself takes on kind of a multidisciplinary or a multi-purpose function, right? He's all of the above, but certainly he's a mouthpiece for God. And then you see other interesting things, that how ironic that he's a mouthpiece, or perhaps how problematized that he's a mouthpiece, and yet, he says to God, well, I don't really speak very well. This, I'm maybe not the best person to do this, or I have real, hesitations about doing this. So even with Moses, right, who becomes in this narrative, and then as other ancient interpreters have seen Moses as well, priest, prophet, even he still has human foibles, right, about angst and, lack of trust that, really God is going to help me to do this enormous, seemingly impossible task. So I think you're spot on. Yeah.
That's very kind of you. So the next one is the relationship between God and the Jewish people, because there's this crazy intimate relationship that's going on. They're his people, and they are. He hears their cries. It's almost anthropomorphic sort of relationship with them, so he's their God. Could you expand on that particular relationship, that especially close relationship that he seems to have with the Jews, particularly following what you said about Genesis earlier?
Yeah, so I think at this point we definitely see this strong ongoing relationship confirmed between God and the Israelites, and yet I think what's intriguing here, so there's a few things. We could jump back for just a moment briefly and look to Genesis 12, where we also see that, the people will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. So, they have a purpose as well. And here in Exodus, even here, there's this strong promise made. We see this, especially evidenced through the act of the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, these kind of amazing activities. And even then, after they're saved and go on their way, we see complaining and, lack of trust, and, we're hungry, we're thirsty, etc. Of course, as you would be as a human traipsing about in desert lands. And so we see the unique nature of the relationship, but we also see, again, the unique nature of the nature of those parties in that covenantal relationship, that God does continue to in an ongoing fashion to forgive the people, to provide manna, water from a rock, etc. Also, that clearly there's a special relationship here that God is committed to upholding and to safeguard this people.
The next one is between God and Pharaoh, and this, or perhaps even Egypt more broadly, but specifically Pharaoh. And there seems to be it's almost like this big, well, on the one hand, there seems to be this big contest that God wants to prove, and maybe you could expand on this with the plagues, that God proving that he is the dominant figure. He is the sort of he rules all the aspects of nature. But also the relationship of God is slightly different here. He's not just the God of the Jews. He is the God of everything. He is the supreme thing of all things that seems to come through there within that contest with Pharaoh. I mean, his ability to sort of harden Pharaoh's heart and things like that.
I was just going to say about the hardening of the heart. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go for it.
I think, again, you're right. I mean, this is a really important relationship, and we see this hardening of the heart as a way, again, to really highlight God's nature as well, that it is God who is sovereign, who is, there might even be other, gods out there that they say that they're God, but, we see different images of this appear at different points in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in 2nd Isaiah, we see examples of, you say that there are other gods, but they're just dead gods. They're not real gods. They're just, clay or, idols made up. We see kind of these different images of, there's other gods, but God is the greatest God, or Adonai, right, as the greatest God. We also see representations where, God is now truly the only God. But in any case, God is the sovereign God. And to the point that God, fashioned the activity in such a way to highlight God's own activity as well, that God is sovereign, that God is the one that will enable.
There's something really sort of, because last week we have Gilgamesh with there are these many gods, and they sort of do all these different things, and it's quite sort of mind-boggling when you think about it, that the Jews are not saying there's all these different gods. It's the God. It is God who's picked us, this group of people, out, and this seems to be coming through in this text here. Is there something briefly you say on that? And then I've got one other question.
I know, so much to discuss. We see certainly in the narrative as well that there's recognition, right, in other places too. For example, in Deuteronomy, again, a lot of the legal prohibitions are against following other worshiping other gods or worshiping other idols. So we definitely see an understanding that there's a knowledge that there are other gods out there for other nations, or at least that other nations, have things that they call gods, Baal, Shemesh, etc. And at varying points of the narrative, we see these other gods come into play as well. But then we do see a transformation over time of, there's an awareness that there are other gods pertaining to other geographic regions that the God of Israel contrasts against. And then subsequently we see an understanding that actually this God of Israel is, the only God above and beyond those other, titles, but that really represent, simply idols. So we do see a difference, like that. This is definitely an idea of one God who is connected with this people. Yeah.
I want to. That's all very fascinating, and I want to move on now to a more broader theme. There's the theme within the whole thing of journey, and you have these two specific journeys. You have the journey of the Jews, which goes broadly throughout the whole thing. So, and it has this pattern of starting in a place. So Abraham starts in Canaan, then they move into the wilderness kind of thing toward Egypt, and then they go back into the wilderness searching to get back home. And then you have a similar thing with Moses, that Moses starts in Egypt, he goes into the wilderness, and then he's sent back to Egypt, but he comes back to Egypt in a very different way. And then he goes in, sort of gets molded into the Jewish story. would you maybe expand on that point about the broad point about that journey that seems to be taking place, whether that fits into wider narratives, and also about sort of their experiences in the wilderness as well, please?
Yeah, I mean, these are really great topics for consideration. I think we could talk about them for a long time. I think I would say we definitely see movement involved in the Hebrew Bible. You know, Abraham from Ur, moving here, moving there. And, you know, if you're trying to chart out a little map, it seems kind of like going all over the place. You know, and same thing, then once you start into the narrative of Deuteronomy, you see, you know, so much movement prior to, you know, entering into the promised land. And then same thing with Moses. It's true, you do see him sort of always on the go, moving to and fro. And there does seem to be some interesting question about, you know, why so much time spent in perpetual movement. But it's, in a way, it's these times of movement when you really start to see some of the formation of this, of the nature of this relationship between God and these people, and the sense that the promise is ongoing and or yet to be fulfilled. And then we see this, I mean, when you say, what about this pattern of journey or movement happening throughout the scripture? I mean, we see it again subsequently when the people go into Babylonian exile and, you know, then subsequently return. And these same themes ultimately do become re-envisioned in the New Testament as well, with, you know, needing to move to and fro to partake in a census or to, you know, escape from, Pharaoh or etc. We see this same kind of theme being undertaken again. So I think the rationale or what's actually happening behind the scenes, all of these different journeys, is not always the same in terms of, the theme that's being unpacked. But certainly I think you're right in that we do see a lot of, it's not necessarily a lot of stuff static, right? It's actually a lot of movement, a lot of ongoing relationship forming that is paralleled in terms of actual movement through physical locale as well.
If I may, just one brief thing at the end. We also have the law, and you have the laws which seem to be about individuals and laws about rituals. Lots of stuff about like the creating of the ark and things. The Jews obviously don't get to their land of flowing with milk and honey at the end. The end of the story is with the creation of the tabernacle and Moses going in and doing worship. Is that is the text trying to make a point there about these rules, that they're still in the wilderness, they haven't got to the end, and it's in that moment that the story in Exodus ends? Or is that just a coincidence or by mistake?
I think it's simply where the story gets to, right? We definitely see that they received the law. This is a critical part of the Exodus as well, right? We see it kind of initiating between Exodus 19 to 24. And then we do see this really interesting, a number of chapters that are expanding on the tabernacle. And, subsequently, when we read about the formation of the temple in Jerusalem, a lot of the, the way that the tabernacle is functioning now is sort of a movable version of what will subsequently become, God's dwelling place in the Jerusalem temple. So we see sort of the formation of, what this dwelling place will look like and how it is that God can reside with them, literally as a kind of a pillar of smoke that's rising or lowering, etc., comes with them as they move about. But we see it here in sort of this early days where they're, still actually embarking themselves. So they've got the promise is still unfolding come the end of Exodus. Yeah.
Okay.
If I could, sorry, Dan.
Go for it. And then you'll
just
pass on to Father James.
As a segue to Father James, because I think it might be helpful to clarify when we come to post-interpretation. And I'd be fascinated to hear what you have to say on how, like, we as Christians, we can look at the text of the Bible as this kind of corpus that has an identity that is very clear and it has a beginning and an end. But I know that for much of the Hebrew history, even up until the time of our Lord, there were, you know, is the Torah, the first 5 books, is that scripture? Do you add on the prophets? Do you add on the book of Psalms? Do you add on the other poetry and wisdom literature? Before Father James is going to address the question of post-interpretation, what was the sense of the sacred text and the early books in relation to the later books?
Oof, that's another really complex question, actually, in terms of the formation of the canon. I mean, we can, in a nutshell, I mean, how to embark on this question in a quick way. In some of the writings that we have, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, are also in early translations of scripture. For example, when we see the Septuagint, right, this translation of the Pentateuch or the Torah into Greek that we see happening in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, right? Scholars would say that there's 2 things happening in tandem. There's the formation of the actual books that become the Bible, and subsequent, like of an actual book on its own. But in addition, and what that looks like in final form, like for example, we actually see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that, a number of other Psalms that do not become included in this canon of the 150 Psalms as we know them. But by the same, and then on the other hand, we also see formation of the books coming together in a particular order and in a particular fashion to be some kind of a concrete canonical structure, right, that we would have Torah, prophets, and writings. And even this process in terms of the Hebrew Bible doesn't really become complete fixed in terms of the text as becoming something that is, a canon that one does not adjust anymore until after 70 CE, after the destruction of the temple, because at this point the temple is gone and the text becomes kind of a fixed and foundational thing, which is why after that we start to see other commentaries, right, and rabbinic works arising, which is sort of the ongoing process after that as a way to continue to think with the texts, even once they themselves enter into a more fixed form.
Thank you for that, Carmen. I'm going to jump in now and just say that actually I'm grateful to David's question because it situates Genesis and Exodus in the sort of wider Old Testament world, or in the wider world of the Hebrew Scriptures. But what I want to bring it back to now is the question of interpretation, not least because, as you'll know, when you spoke with us last week about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in moving into this week and speaking about Genesis and Exodus, what you're in fact doing is laying the groundwork for us as we move forward across a survey of literature in the Western world. And so we'll move into, for example, Homer. These 2 weeks have been about looking at foundation stories, and that then raises a question of interpretation, not least because there are those who would see these texts as something a good deal more important than a mere story, as if somehow by calling them stories we're diminishing them. But what I want to explore with you is how ancient interpreters, how other ancient interpreters have thought about these texts. And in that respect, I would ask first about the views of Philo of Alexandria. As some of our viewers may know, he was a Hellenized Jew, and I think he would represent an interesting figure, an interesting point of reference for us in asking about how these texts were interpreted.
Yeah, thank you, James. This is a great line of thinking and of questioning. And I mean, I think And I echo your the comment that you raised, which is even if we suggest, even if I use the language of stories or narratives, this in no way is diminishing the value and the importance of the text. And I think, as you say, when we look at this long line of interpreters, or as Emmanuel Levinas would say, looking through the long lens of history or tradition, we can see that the text had ongoing value and significance. And we can see that too, and again, in sort of a twofold stream of, on the one hand, how right from 1000 BCE through till the formation of the Masoretic text, we see on one hand also a real careful copying of texts, that in fact every letter is the same, every consonant is the same, that there's no error, right? A very strong copying tradition. But also simultaneous with that, a tradition whereby scribes would also rework texts, re-scripturalize them, that this was a way of highlighting that the prophetic idea was ongoing and that they were still regarded as scripture, but reflecting a contemporary point for themselves. And so if we look at the work of Philo of Alexandria in the sort of segue to first century CE period, we definitely see he's writing sort of as commentary, but in a way he's also re-scripturalizing even himself. And for him, as a Hellenistic Jew, it's really interesting to see this blend of cultures, right? So he'll be talking about Abraham, and he lifts up many of the different scriptural figures as very important, key figures that we should emulate. And he does so using very Greco-Roman terms. I mean, he talks about Abraham and Abraham's virtue, right? And, friendship, virtue. These are really kind of Roman terms, right? Interesting ways to describe. And that that in a way, what Abraham is doing is sort of fashioning a perfect realm, and that we are trying to emulate this sort of perfection in a way, right? Whereas the Hebrew Bible isn't speaking something about perfection, but this is how Philo is now reinterpreting the text and thinking about law and what law means as kind of a perfect copy, and how to attain this kind of perfection in terms of emulating these individuals, and using really Hellenized terminology in order to do so. Yeah.
Do we see anything similar then in another Hellenized Jew, and that would be Paul?
Yes. Do you have more to say on that?
Well, I'm thinking about an image that's very sort of dear to my own heart because of my interest in Irenaeus, who picks up on this and develops it extensively in the second century. But I'm thinking about the contrast between Adam and Jesus, for example. This is a development that we see in Paul in particular. But I mean, like Philo, he's a Hellenized Jew. He's clearly got a facility with the kind of vocabulary that Philo would have had. But he's applying it with a very particular interest. And I'm wondering if you might tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this, again, is a complex question. We definitely see Paul working with him in a way which seems to be a very dualistic structure, right? Because on one hand, we see him talking about sarx, about flesh. And on the other hand, we also see him talking about spirit, and trying to figure out, well, what exactly is he talking about? And, some scholars now, including myself, would suggest in a way he's combining these two things together. For example, he is describing early Christ followers as a kind of ethnos, an ethnicity, but it's one that has both both a very fleshly element, also a very spiritual element. And it's sort of in this umbrella of combining these different dichotomies together that you can then actually subsequently have a Jew who is a Christ follower hand in hand with a Gentile who does not need and who should not practice circumcision, but who is also a Christ follower. And it's sort of under this one umbrella of both the sarx, the fleshly, as well as the spiritual, that you can actually subsequently have a kind of a Christ follower ethnos, in a way. You can become a Christ follower ethnicity, which is its own sort of a hybrid ethnicity. And I mean, this is really particular that Paul could only envision or envisage in the context of his Hellenized world, as you say. Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. There's I think one of the questions that would stand out in many people's minds is that of miracles. So many of the stories in Genesis and in Exodus seem quite literally incredible. And in that respect, I mean, I think of one that we'll all know well from Heston's version, but the parting of the Red Sea. And you know, that's obviously treated and spoken about differently across sort of interpretive traditions. But I'm thinking of the wisdom of Solomon and you know, how it's accounted for there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so I think you definitely see this as you say, this miraculous narrative of the parting of the Red Sea, or as now some interpreters suggest, the parting of the Sea of Reeds, which would subsequently indicate, you know, kind of any body of water. This has captured the imagination, right, of other interpreters, and many of those works which have from scripture themselves within various traditions. So if we look at the wisdom of Solomon, here we again see really interesting, the theme of Egypt is really strong and prevalent, which could indicate, again, you know, part of the provenance of where this text has stemmed from and the time period. But we definitely see this intrigue again in the parting of the sea, and, you know, sort of this playing around with, you know, well, what was it really like when the waters parted? And, you know, I mean, I've had students ask this question in the past too, you know, do you think it was really muddy? If these people were really elderly, would it be hard to traverse? And in a way, Wisdom of Solomon is just doing the same thing by envisioning, you know, perhaps it was like a grassy plain, you know, which would be most miraculous that you could subsequently cross with, you know, no hardship at all. But that in fact, the parting of the waters, you know, there emerged kind of a grassy field in fact. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, like your other questioners tonight, I think honestly there's just so much that we could explore with you. But the thing I would like you to comment on finally really is what we do with these things today. I mean, not only scholarly interpreted by way of scholarly interpretation, but in terms of how we ourselves approach the texts, whether we have theological expertise or not. How would you suggest we approach these texts? What do we carry away from them?
I think, I mean, my hope would be that we would approach these texts in the same way that other readers, hearers, and ancient interpreters have done over the course of time, which is to look at the text in one view, and also to think about their contemporary context in the other view, and try to find a way to fit these two things together, to see how can this text be relevant for me in my contemporary context, and what can I take away from the text. And to also sort of, again, look at the big picture in terms of what are the main themes here, right, that I want to take away, including this, you know, strong sense of a relationship between God and a people, and this clear idea that God is sovereign and that God is forgiving, that God, you know, sees exactly what humankind is doing, and yet continues to fashion relationship and fashion opportunities for the turning of the heart, right? In Hebrew, this verb is shuv, like to turn or return, to turn one's heart to God, and to renew this covenantal relationship. I mean, I think this is really one of the most foundational, ongoing, and prevalent themes that we find in the scriptural account.
Wonderful. Dr. Carmen Palmer, thank you very, very much for your input across the last 2 weeks, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the near future.
I hope so. I've really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. We're all now back in the room, and I expect that everybody found that as helpful this week as they did last week. As Father David said at the very beginning, of course, we don't have Dr. Palmer with us, but we'll be happy to field questions to the best of our ability. So if anybody has anything to start us off with by way of questions, please indicate that visually, or else just send it through the chat function at the bottom of Zoom.
I should say, I think if anybody's disappointed a little bit in the lecture, it might be because we tried to bite off more than we can chew. We kind of did a panorama of the Hebrew Bible, and in doing so, we might have lost sight of the kind of coherence that Carmen was, I think, actually trying to get at. But because we kept jumping from the Torah to, the histories to the Book of Wisdom, I think that the genius was lost in the sense of the coherence between the God of creation becoming the God of Abraham, and the God of Abraham becoming the God of the psalmist, and the God of the psalmist becoming the God of the prophets, and the God of the prophets becoming that God which our Lord called his Father. And that whole kind of dynamic, I think, was a little bit lost in the conversation, but I think it was present. It was just not as clear as it might have been. But I'd be interested to hear what other people think.
We'll come to your statement right away, David, but I see just before you began that Scott Wheeler had a question he wanted to raise. So if we go to him and come back to that point. Scott.
Hi. Father David, one of the questions that you raised early on was about whether evil was present in Genesis 1 and by extension the rest of the creation, or whether it was something that emerged later. I've got a bit of a meta question about that. Good and evil are clearly there as adjectives, and I wondered, in the original context, are good and evil there as nouns, or is that something that we've put in as a later concept?
Grammar is not a strong point for me. What do you mean?
Well, okay, I think this is probably an old analogy, but for instance, light is something which clearly exists. Darkness is something rather different. Physically, it's an absence of light. So although you could refer to light with a capital L and darkness with a capital D, they don't exist in equal ways. Now, when we're talking about the emergence of evil, is that something that's more of a medieval concept, or is that actually something that's present in Genesis? So it's a question about the way that that it was thought about at the time.
I think that was my question to Carmen about were the texts that we're looking at tonight, were they a deliberate argument about the nature of good and evil? Or are we just, because I mean, the way you just worded that was totally St. Augustine, right? It was totally a kind of Neoplatonic, good is being, evil is the absence of being, evil has no substance. Was that actually present in the text? If you asked Augustine, absolutely. If you asked the ancient rabbis, I don't know. And that was what I was hoping Carmen could answer. And she seemed to suggest that it wasn't present. But clearly the question of good and evil was present in the ancient world because we have the emergence of so much dualism, where good and evil are these competing forces. Whereas Genesis seems to be this argument that there is no dualism. There are no two equal forces facing each other. There is only the good. And evil enters as a kind of impotency.
There is a related question to that, but maybe if I can come back to that later.
Is that like a teaser?
Do you want me to mention it now or later?
Sure. Mention it now.
There is a theory I've come across about the purpose of Genesis 1, which is that it's a demythologization of ancient Near East creation myths. So the struggle between Marduk and Tiamat, for instance, where Tiamat, symbolizing chaos, is destroyed. But it's demythologized to the extent that there is no pantheon there, there is no sentient opposition, there is just chaos, the waters, which are ordered. And that might be the purpose of Genesis 1, to say there is only God, there is no sentient opposition to God, or at least no chaotic sentient opposition to God. I don't know how widely accepted that theory is.
Yeah, I mean, that is what I think is going on in the text. And I think in a similar way, it was going on in Greek philosophy later. This idea that when people actually take time to contemplate the world, they realize that the ultimate image, the ultimate one, must be good. Otherwise, all being kind of disintegrates. And so whatever evil is, it is something secondary to what is the real being of things.
Good, thank you, David. Do we have any follow-up questions to that? Anything anybody would like to pick up on? Yes, Gianni.
So I guess I have a question about the Tower of Babel, because I'm not entirely sure how you're meant to like interpret if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. Like if I was just reading that, that seems like God is kind of scared of, you know, people in the Iron Age making this probably like 2-story tower, and it just seems very odd. So if you could explain that.
Oh, thanks, G. We already spent too much time talking about all the details of the Old Testament, and you bring up the one detail that we didn't bring up.
Although actually, I
also
did
have Nephilim. That's the second question.
I did have some thoughts on this, Jenny, when I was reading the text. And do you remember when I asked Dr. Palmer about redemption, and we talked about pride, which manifests itself in self-will? To me, the Tower of Babel, it's a manifestation of unrestrained self-will, which, because it's not a good thing, ultimately can only be destructive. So the way I read it was that actually, because everything God does in these texts is revelatory of his character, it's actually an act of kindness that he's, at least that's how I would interpret it, as him stopping humans from running away with themselves.
As in they'll get too powerful for their own good type thing.
Yeah, because, you know, what they're trying to do is something which could eventually collapse under its own weight, perhaps could have even jeopardized salvation history. So that's the way I would interpret it. I wouldn't interpret it as God being in any way petty or sort of threatened by humanity's endeavors.
Can I follow up on that? So I think that was a good response there, and it seems to have some reflection with the Epic of Gilgamesh. So part of the thing that Gilgamesh is concerned about is making a name for himself. And we were talking in our tutorial last week about man desiring, part of the problem in nature is man ordering nature to his will rather than to the will of the whole or of the divine. And I guess perhaps the key line is they say that their main motive seems to be, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. I see that Michael has raised his hand to ask a question. So Michael, I would invite you to come forward.
Okay. Two questions. The first is the one about referring to the devil as the serpent. I want to know, is it an allegory, or which figure of speech would that be, or is that real? Was it the serpent that actually tempted our first parents, or is it like a kind of image? Because it's also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh went to the stream, and the snake took the plant that he was to take to his people from him. That's one. Then two, I'm also wondering, the flood, how, I know that God said we should take dominion of all creatures, but how Noah would have been able to bring all the beasts together into one place. So those are things I've been thinking about.
Thank you, Michael. I think in my imagination, the image of the devil is clearly allegorical. I mean, I don't think that Satan is walking around with scales and slithering around, but it is the image for ancients. If you wanted to raise yourself to the heavens, what is the lowest creature? The lowest creature is the one who just slithers around the earth. And so the serpent represents this earthbound, unable to raise its head toward the heavens. To the second question about the flood, and it might bring up G's question about the Tower of Babel. You know, in many ways, is the Old Testament a kind of negotiation between God and humankind? That you're going to build cities, and that's going to necessitate a certain potency of evil. But you can go ahead and build cities. Human culture has a potential for good, but it also has a huge potential for evil. You want a king, terrible idea, but we'll give you one. And we'll even use that to bring forth the Messiah. So there's this kind of continual negotiation between, you know, a wrestling in what Lucy brought up with Jacob, a wrestling with God about what the nature of history will be. Does that help at all, Michael?
Yes, it does. It does.
Good. Thank you for that. Is there anything else? I see Lewis, you've raised your hand. If you could come forward.
Thank you. I'm just curious. But she was talking about Lucy's question about circumcision, and when she gave an answer, you know, that it paralleled this idea of circumcision of the heart, or that emerged out of the tradition of circumcision. And I'm just wondering if the kind of need for an inner transformation is whether that's sort of, and maybe nobody here's the expert to ask on this, which is unfortunate, but whether the idea of an inner transformation is sort of an innovation in the ancient Near East, or if that's something common to all religions.
I'll jump in there. I don't have any immediate answer, especially when it comes to the the ancient Near East, or even further afield. I do know that when you move forward in time and you're looking at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the idea of inner transformation would have been essentially moot, because the individual, the very notion of an individual, would have been almost meaningless. So this concern with an individual's response to divine command simply doesn't exist. And there are scholars who would say that that is widespread and almost exclusive to Judaism and later Christianity.
I would disagree.
Yeah, except that you're wrong.
Only because Father James and I are old friends, I can disagree. I think there was the sense of the individual's rejection of the divine order, but the context of the individual's rejection of the divine order was a simultaneous movement of the individual's movement against the social order. So if you were going to reject God, you were going to reject social order. But there was still that movement of the individual that said, no, I am going to be a bandit that stands on the side of the road and robs people. Even though everybody in the culture knew it was wrong, there were individuals that did that. Was it viewed as a moral transgression against a divine command? Probably in a secondary sense. In a primary sense, it was viewed as a step against the social order. But the two were, because the individual was not, we hadn't had the subjectivity yet, the social order was kind of united with the divine order. But there was always a stepping against it.
So that seems to be different in the Hebrew tradition. You get, like, everything seems to be in reference to the covenant as opposed to the social order. So is there, is that remarkable, what's going on in the Hebrew tradition then? This sort of, rootedness in the relationship to the divine?
There's one comment on that would be, I can't really go into any proper depth, but it's true to say, at least a lot of historians of the first century Palestine, first century AD and first century BC, argue that is one of the key characteristics of the Jews that distinguishes them from other societies at the time. So, for example, E.P. Sanders, who's a quite big historian in that period, he argues that he points out that a lot of societies at the time would have had circumcision. A lot of societies at the time would have had the similar sort of rules on what you can eat. But what marked particularly the Jews out was that they didn't see it as being a simply practical thing. It was something ordained to them by God and rooted in this covenant, first and foremost. That's what the historians I've read on that particular period say anyway.
I will give it a last call for questions. And seeing that there appear to be none, I will bring it to a close. I'll simply say that I want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. I think I certainly hope you feel it's been fruitful. I think it has been. I am very appreciative of the input of Dr. Palmer, who was an excellent conversation partner, and we would look forward to having her back with us again. And we will look forward to seeing all of you again with us next week. We are anticipating that our speaker then, Dr. Davith Frost, will be with us live, and so we'll be able to engage on another level again. But in the meantime, if you wish to visit the Center for Applied Theology's website and consider membership for yourself, that would be very much appreciated. But whether you do that or not, we look forward to your ongoing participation in the Urban Abbey endeavor to roll out these wonderful texts. Thank you, God bless, and good night.